objection to the freedom of thought and freedom of belief, particularly the freedom of religious belief. But how can we have freedom of religious belief when the government structures education in a way that effectively requires parents to send their children to government schools where they will be intellectually molded in a strictly secular curriculum designed by government officials? A secular curriculum is no more neutral toward believers than is a religious curriculum to non-believers. If the public schools basically taught from a religious perspective, I think it would be secular parents who would be saying, hey, wait a minute, we need school choice. We shouldn't have to send our kids to a public school where they are inculcated in a religious view of the world. We need at least some options to educate our children elsewhere. But Duncan, what's your problem? If the secular public schools are not a good fit for your children, just send your kids to private religious schools. This is still a free country. Well, the problem, of course, is that the public schools have a monopoly over the funding of education. We have the right to choose private religious education for our children under Pierce versus Society of Sisters, but only by sacrificing the educational funding paid for by our tax dollars. That is the brutal bargain I mentioned before. Educate your kids in a public school, or if you want, in a private school, but if you go to a private school, you lose $650,000 worth of public support for the education of your children. Selective funding of education guarantees religious inequality in two respects. Some religious families, like mine, the lucky ones, who can afford to educate their children in private religious schools. I took a hit, $650,000 hit. It's not exactly chump change for a law professor. But, you know, we survived. We eat, we have a home, we're okay. We suffer only an economic penalty by losing a large public benefit that our tax dollars have paid for when we choose to exit from public schools. But a larger class of religious families suffers a far worse fate. They really don't have a choice. They are forced to send their children into the public schools where they receive a secular education. As Stephen Ahrens puts it, the present method of financing American education discriminates against the poor and the working class, and even a large part of the middle class, by conditioning the exercise of First Amendment rights of school choice upon an ability to pay while simultaneously eroding the ability to pay through the regressive collection of taxes used exclusively for government schools. If you're a UPS truck driver with 3 kids and a $40,000 a year income, as a friend of mine I go to church with is, do you have a real choice about whether your children are educated in secular government schools or in private religious schools? Suppose you're a minority parent living in the inner city, one with a failing public school district, or a working class parent raising your children on Staten Island rather than the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Do you have a real choice about the education of your children? What did the Clintons and the Obamas and the Trumps do about K through 12 education during the White House years? Did they send Chelsea, Sasha, Malia, and Barron to the DC public schools? Well, the Trumps haven't had to face it yet. They're keeping Barron in the New York City private schools. I suspect that he'll either stay in New York City or go to a private school. But Chelsea Clinton and Sasha and Malia Obama attended Sidwell Friends private school in the District of Columbia during the White House years. Sidwell Friends is a super elite private Quaker school which seeks to infuse Quaker religious values in its curriculum. Indeed, the children of most elite lawyers and corporate executives and politicians often attend elite private schools. Many of these same people oppose school choice for poor and middle-class families. So if we care about liberty, about religious liberty and freedom of belief formation, and the right of all parents to direct the education of their children, what should we do? Well, I believe we should support school choice. And you know, it's in the wind. We've got a Secretary of Education who supports school choice. A lot of people don't like her. But we've got a lot more libertarian sentiment, I think, among young people. So I think school choice is in the wind. But I think that's what we should do. We should support school choice, a program of equal funding for the education of each child, regardless of which school he or she attends. I think average families should have some of the same educational choices that elite and privileged families have. If private schools are good for Chelsea and Sasha and Malia and Barron, then they're good for Tom, Mary, Billy, and Susie as well. We all pay taxes to finance education. And all of our children are entitled to their fair share of these benefits, whether they attend public, private, or parochial schools. I'll set homeschooling aside for the moment. Although I think school choice will improve the quality of education, and things like SAT scores, because competition is good in education as elsewhere. In one sense, that is irrelevant to the libertarian ideal. School choice is about choice. I may choose to send my kids to a school that doesn't quite have the higher SAT scores because I think they have a better worldview that they're teaching from that school, better character formation perhaps from that school. That should be my choice. School choice is necessary if we believe in freedom of thought and freedom of religion. Mill was right. The last thing free citizens should want is for government to be in control of the education of children, over the molding of the minds and hearts of kids. Now, I know I've got an uphill battle because, you know, anytime I speak to a class of law school students, most of you went to public schools, and many of you had good experiences. And that's great. That's a choice that should be available to you. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about each family having a number of choices, not just the public school option. Even non-religious parents should be horrified at the thought of government molding the hearts and minds of their children. We worry about the NSA invading our privacy by reading a few of our emails or text messages. How much worse when the government uses its power to shape the mind, to shape and mold the minds and hearts of our children every day for 13 years. Kids spend more time in school than they spend at home with their parents once they get to school age. Diversity of education is a powerful check on governmental power. Instead of the government's views always being taught, we have a multiplicity of views. We have diversity of views. But notice I'm not suggesting that school choice be available only for religious people. I'm adopting the libertarianism of John Stuart Mill and calling for educational choice for all parents. If we protect liberty for everyone, we protect both secular liberty and religious liberty. And everyone, regardless of religion, will be able to flourish in a large private domain. Freedom for all is freedom for each one. And one last point before I sit down. Some would argue that school choice results in non-believers being taxed to fund religious education for believers. That somehow this is unfair to unbelievers. It certainly isn't unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has upheld a true private choice program. But is that true in some way, that non-believers are being forced to subsidize religious education for believers? Well, unlike public schools, which as we have seen are most definitely not neutral between religion and non-religion, school choice for each child is strictly neutral because everyone, regardless of their religious or non-religious views, gets equal K through 12 funding. And let me just sit down with this quote because I want to make sure we've got time for commentary. Indeed, Michael McConnell and Richard Posner, Judge Posner, in an article that I think was published in Harvard many years ago, take the position that equal funding of school choice is necessary. They argue that it might even be constitutionally required under the First Amendment for neutrality. They explain the economic impact of school choice this way. No one is taxed to support the religious education of another. Rather, each person pays one lifetime's worth of taxes earmarked for education, and in return receives in advance one education. They're not looking at the parents paying for a kid's education. They're looking at each kid. Each kid gets one free state-supported education, and then each kid repays that loan. It's almost like a loan through a lifetime of taxes. Of course, things would not work out as neatly in practice as they do in this very abstract model. There would still be a subsidy from rich to poor, there always is. But there would be no systematic transfer of wealth from individuals who attend religious schools to those who do not. On the contrary, to force individuals to pay education taxes, but deny them education financing because they have chosen a religious school, brings about a systematic transfer of wealth from the religious to the non-religious. Another scholar says to deny aid to religious families for education constitutes a tax on religious exercise that skews private choice away from religion. So I think I'll stop here. I think I've given you a pretty good idea of what I think the libertarian perspective is, and I look forward to some commentary and some Q&A. Thanks.
All right, offering a contrary position is a man who, by his own admission, needs no introduction, Professor Lou Mulligan.
obviously the first choice was the civil procedure professor. So I'm excited to be here. Noting I'm not a scholar in this area. But what I would throw out is this. It's interesting. I love John Stuart Mill, as it turns out. I've been a nerd for a long, long time. And so I busted out my John Stuart Mill on Liberty, and I was like, where did everyone get this idea that John Stuart Mill actually supports the proposition that was advanced by him? And I actually don't think that he does. If the injury is double taxation, if that's how we want to call it, because definitely John Stuart Mill promotes the idea that there should be freedom of choice, right? A freedom to choose. But the idea that there's an injury in the double taxation, I think explicitly he does not agree to. So if we were, the section that was read from starts out, were the duty of enforcing universal education once admitted, there would be blah, 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 blah. Then he goes on to say, we might leave it to parents to choose where they would go, and we should support school fees for poorer classes of children and defraying the entire school expense for those who have no ability to pay. But he clearly envisions the idea that the rich are going to pay their own private education, and they're going to pay twice, right? And they're going to pay for their own kids to go to Eton, in his case, right? Or have a horrible abusive education from his father, which was John Stuart Mill's case, right? And pay for someone else's education too. And to the degree to which you think the Mill's endorsement of this proposition is important to you, I think Mill endorses kind of something like what we have now, which is there should be no prohibition against different forms of education. That's clearly what he is addressing. The idea that there would be a monopoly on the type of education you would get, and that the state should fund the Model T version, right? And if you want something different, go out and buy it for yourself. So the idea that Mill's injury was a double payment injury, which I understand was your view, and that's different from what Mill's view. So I wouldn't say that Mill would endorse the double payment injury as something that he's concerned about. I don't think that's what he was talking about. Indeed, the Forster Act in England isn't passed till 1870, and this is, when is this, 1850 something? Anyways, well before public education in the UK. So I don't think that Mill endorses the idea that there's an injury in double payment. Rather, the injury would be in a coercive, exactly as we're talking about of Oregon, the state mandating that you get their education with no ability to opt out even on your own nickel, right? That's what he's against, and which I would agree 100%, right? The real question then, I think, gets down to, is there an injury, a normative injury, for this double payment? Right? I think that's the question. So I'm definitely in favor of people should be able to choose where they want to send their kids, school your kids at home, nor am I saying that public schools are panacea or the best thing since sliced bread. I think that's the question. So I'd focus it on that general question of, is there an injury in the government taxing you for stuff that you're not going to use? Well, if that's the injury, right, and I know that many of our libertarian friends say, yes, that is the injury, but that's a principle that goes pretty deep, right? You could be like me and hate nature. I abhor nature. I as much as I can abuse it and destroy it, that's what I like to do. But they tax me to pay for national parks, right? I'm leaving my car on right now, destroying nature. But in any event, right, I'm still going to be taxed to pay for national parks, even if I'm not someone who's going to use it, right? I will be taxed to pay for museums.